Cyclops is the X-Man. He is what the X-Men aspire to be. He is their leader, and he's someone that was kind of shoved to the side for the last, give or take, 22-ish years, especially prior to X-Men 97. Scott was shoved to a side mainly to make room for Wolverine, as he was the more popular of the X-Men. But I think X-Men Evolution as a show does an extremely good job of showing Scott as not only the leader of the X-Men, but as the X-Man. And while the first season keeps Scott fairly static within how his character is, he does still have a lot of things that I feel is worth talking about. And so without further ado, let's talk about Scott Summers. The very first time that we see Scott in this show, he is acting like a big brother. He is almost always going to put himself in danger to defend people he doesn't even fully know. For example, in the first episode, when Toad is caught stealing wallets off of people, Duncan, one of the football players and recurring characters in this show, ends up attacking Toad. And of course, Scott Summers isn't going to allow that to happen. He blatantly stands up to Duncan in an event to hopefully not get Toad beaten and instead simply have him return the cash. But Duncan basically tells him to butt out and makes fun of his shades, which is something that Scott is particularly touchy about, which makes sense. It is technically the thing that makes him different, even in an outward appearance way. But in the process of Scott fighting, he ends up getting his sunglasses knocked off when he's distracted by Jean, and unfortunately, because Scott has no control over his optic blasts, he ends up blowing up a propane tank and essentially causing an explosion during a Bayview High football game. Also, why were the football players even underneath the bleachers during a football? Like, I was a football player. Coach would never let us be under the bleachers. Never mind. Going off on a tangent. It's evident from the first episode, Scott is a fighter. He is most likely going to throw caution to the wind if it means standing in and stepping up for his peers, or at least his believed peers. Now, thankfully, Scott didn't hurt anybody, surprisingly. Nothing more than a minor concussion for Duncan. But as far as introductions go, I think it's a very good look into who Cyclops is as a person. It is pretty indicative of who he is, without any of the nuance, of course, as we're just getting to see him for the first time. And another thing this episode sets up expeditiously is the fact that Scott and Jean have a little something going on. While they're not officially dating at this point, they're at least very close friends and very closely intertwined with one another. Now, I think where the episode really picks up for Scott in particular is his first meeting with Nightcrawler, who is introduced in the very first episode and is shown to be very different. Something Scott does react a little bit weirdly to at first, but we'll see him warm up to as the episode goes on. As even though he is the poster child for mutant acceptance, even he's off-put by some features. But it's not just Nightcrawler that Scott meets in this episode that he is off-put by. The other mutant Scott meets from the very first interaction he had in this episode is Toad. Now, Toad is a mutant who is brand new to this whole mutant thing. He hasn't been recruited by Xavier, nor has he been recruited by the burgeoning Brotherhood, who have yet to make their first appearances. Now, Toad is very much not Scott's kind of person. He is going to take Scott's shades, he's going to mess with him, but even knowing all of that, Scott still wants to extend his hand to Toad to welcome him into the X-Mansion.
Anyway, he's not the kind of guy I'd really want to share a room with. I mean, to put it bluntly, he's got the personal hygiene of a dead pig.
We cannot turn our backs on anyone, Scott. You know that.
Yeah, I know. So, should I bring him in?
No need, Scott.
But before Scott can even try to welcome him, Toad has already tried to come back to the mansion because him and Nightcrawler got into a sort of beef prior in the episode. And so now Toad is essentially trying to get back at Nightcrawler, and unfortunately in the process, Nightcrawler ends up putting a lot of the X-Men in harm's risk with his little feud between him and Toad. And yet, despite all of this, Scott takes a liking to Kurt. The two characters will get extremely close throughout the rest of this show, with Scott honestly playing more of that big brother role, especially to Kurt, with him being new to the X-Men and new to this country in general. And I think it's a really great way of looking at Scott's role throughout this first season. And I think as a first episode, it sets up Scott fairly well.
But look, we all mess up sometimes. I know I do. That's why we're all here, to learn not to make mistakes like that. That's why we'd like you to stay.
We see Scott playing the big brother in the very next episode to Kurt. It's really the best dynamic in this first season for my money, personally. It's one of my favorites. But essentially, Kurt is once again late for class, and Scott has to swoop in and basically cover for him so that he doesn't get in too much trouble with the principal, who is Mystique, by the way. And this episode in particular isn't too important to Scott's character. It's more about developing the relationship between Kurt and Scott, and showing how the two of them are getting closer and becoming closer friends, especially throughout the episode, as the two pretty much ditch studying after school in order to go follow Logan, who is trying to fight his arch nemesis Sabretooth. And it's also when we're getting introduced more thoroughly to Scott's car, which is something of a pride and joy throughout this first season especially.
Lost him! Hey, watch the door panel! They're smudge resistant, not dent resistant.
And pretty much the only other important thing to cover in this episode is it sets up a nice little running gag that I thoroughly enjoy throughout the rest of this show, all involving Scott's car.
My car!
Not my ride!
But outside of Scott's big brother nature, his willingness to fight for the people in front of him, we also get to see the other side of that, which is his caring nature. Especially this shines through well in the episode that Rogue first appears in. Scott is actually fairly empathetic to Rogue, much like the rest of the X-Men are, especially when it comes to light that she's not 100% with getting with this team, especially because she feels as though she is being hunted by the X-Men. Obviously, the X-Men do not know this, so for Scott and the rest of them, it just feels like she's attacking for no reason. Scott is one of the few X-Men that continually make an effort to try and secure Rogue's trust throughout this episode, despite the fact that she clearly doesn't trust a single one of them, no matter how much they try to put up this face of being a good, likable team. He even runs after Rogue when she is running away from Storm, someone who she perceived attacked her. Wow, that was a lot of she's and hers. And at the end of the episode, Scott was far more preoccupied with protecting Storm and taking care of one of his own, rather than just simply getting to defeat Rogue and getting her to stop using her powers. Now, episode 4 does also do a pretty good job of showing Scott's more compassionate side, specifically towards Rogue, but it's worth setting up, at least for now, the fact episode 4's main antagonist is Fred Dukes, aka the Blob, and his searing love for Jean Grey. He actually really loves Jean in this episode, simply because Jean's pretty and nice to him. And while Fred Dukes is the A-plot, the B-plot of the episode, which I really want to focus on, is the relationship between Rogue and Scott. Even though Rogue very much does not like the X-Men, and Scott isn't on the best terms with Rogue, the two are tasked in class to do a scene from a play which involves them being, well, romantically involved. And throughout this process of getting this scene set up, Scott overhears multiple times, in fact, from his classmates at how basically Rogue is being insulted, and while Scott doesn't do a whole lot to stand up for her, he at least doesn't believe in the insults and would rather ask if she's comfortable doing this scene, and just try to make Rogue as comfortable as possible, simply because he believes she could be a hero and an asset. But that also doesn't keep him from having his usual talks at lunch about how terrible this might be.
You and the Rogue? Ah, now that is a strange combination, yeah?
Yeah. I gotta play a romantic scene with a girl who thinks we tried to kill her. Man, she's gonna have to be some kind of actress.
And while all of this is going on, Blob accidentally starts a gigantic food fight inside of the cafeteria because he accidentally launched his massive lunch on top of another student. And in the process, Blob gets extremely angry and starts lashing out, which leaves Jean wanting to, kind of comfort him and to calm him down like she did earlier, but she fails to in a very spectacular way. And of course, if there's one thing we know about Scott, it's that he loves Jean to death, and he very much will not let her get hurt in any sort of capacity. And so now Scott is very much not only angry at Blob, but wants absolutely nothing to do with him, even if Jean wants to still see him on a more sympathetic side, and she would rather calm him down. But in the process, Rogue sees all of this go down.
Wow, y'all really look out for each other, don't ya?
Yeah, we do that.
And while that conversation was short-lived, it does start to plant the seeds for Rogue that maybe Scott and the X-Men are not so bad, especially when Scott decides to stand up for her in front of Miss Darkholme. It's again his compassion that shines through, onto Rogue even if the two aren't on the same sides of the fight just yet. Oh, and it's also worth mentioning that Blob absolutely loses his mind when he figures out that Scott and Jean might potentially be a couple, and while all of that is going down, Scott is trying to work his way into warming up to Rogue, getting her to warm up to him specifically, so the two might be closer acquainted, and it is working pretty well.
An angel is like you, Kate, and you are like an angel.
The girls are right. You are a charmer.
Look, I'm just reading the lines, okay?
And even though Scott is genuinely being himself and trying to get to know Rogue better, especially in the current situation that they're in, not everything is going to go perfect in this interaction, because when Scott learned that Jean has been kidnapped by the Blob, he absolutely crashes out. Like, Scott loses it. Not only does he yell at his best friend Nightcrawler, but he also yells at Rogue. It's because he cares so much for Jean, he's willing to throw just about everything away in order to get her back, simply because he cares about her so much. And this care causes Scott to go overboard when trying to attack Blob, and ends up getting himself beaten pretty handedly because he tries to go in guns blazing without any sort of strategy, because he is too focused on trying to save Jean. But oddly enough, it would actually be Rogue who ends up saving Jean from Blob, all because Scott was fairly nice to her previously in the episode.
You are like an angel, Kate.
My name's not Kate, and I'm no angel.
So far, I've done a lot of talking about Scott as a character and him as a person, but I haven't really spoken on one of Scott's main traits and characteristics, especially in the comics, which is his leadership. And to be wholeheartedly honest, Scott is a very hard-headed leader. He's almost militant in the way in which he leads the X-Men. As a matter of fact, when he hears that there is going to be a party at Duncan's house, he practically forbids the X-Men from going, especially Kurt, all in fear that they might get exposed as mutants, especially Kurt, because if anybody were to bump into or feel him, they'd realize he doesn't really look like that.
Now see? That's exactly what I'm talking about.
You pulled my tail, man!
Grow up, Kurt.
Hey, lighten up, dude!
You're always goofing around.
And you're seriously cramping my style!
Now, Scott is so militant in his leadership and demands so much of the people around him that he is more than willing to damage his own friendships in order to get his point across and to make sure they do things his way. And Jean is very quick to point this out to him. So I haven't spoke about Jean a lot in this video because I plan to do a video for her, but I want to speak on the fact that Jean is very much Scott's anchor. She keeps Scott level and basically is the one who is going to explain to him when he's doing something out of whack, and this is one of those moments. Now, while Jean and Scott are trying to have this conversation, as it turns out, Nightcrawler has completely gone missing from just about everywhere, and that gets both Scott and Jean extremely concerned. And even though Scott is extremely upset with Kurt at the moment based on what had just previously happened, he's still more than willing to try and fight for Kurt and figure out where he is, as at the end of the day he does view Kurt as a sort of little brother and the two of them are extremely close, which is also a testament to how much this dude cares about being a leader and having things done his way, because he was willing to ruin that relationship. Now, Jean is actually able to get into somewhat of a psychic link with Kurt, and that helps them track down where he might be, and that leads them to finding Toad, who has a device and is using it to disintegrate things all across the campus. And that's also where they find Rogue, in which the team also learns that Rogue had been using said device to accidentally zap Kurt out of different universes. Now, obviously, they're going to try and get Kurt back from his apparent disintegration, but they're not doing a very great job of it until Scott comes up with a plan because he knows Kurt so well.
I think he wants us to reset this thing. Score!
Because Scott knows Kurt so well, he understands the vague message that Kurt was trying to leave for Team X-Man, and in the end, ends up getting the portal to open on the other end. But unfortunately for them, they have to fight now the Brotherhood in order to keep said portal open so Kurt can come back. And it is worth noting that Rogue, while refusing to fight them, also doesn't fight with them just yet. And the episode ends on a fairly happy note, in which Kurt is released along with the dude who's been trapped in there since like the 80s or 90s, and Scott even learns a few things and apologizes.
Holowatch.
So it's true. You really are ashamed of me.
Right, dude. Hey, listen, about what happened before. My bad.
Not only does Scott decide to apologize, but he also decides to lighten up as a person. And he also decides that it is a good thing for Team X to all go to Duncan's party. And I think it's a big step for Scott, but unfortunately, because of the nature of this show, it doesn't really stick that much. Scott will still be shown throughout the rest of this season even to be a pretty hard-headed leader. Regardless, the next big point I want to talk about with Scott is his belief in mutants. He truly believes in the ability of other mutants to become good, to join his side, to coexist and live well with the populace. Now, of course, this shows itself the most in episode 7, in which Scott finds out that during one of their training sessions, Professor Xavier has put in Rogue as one of the enemies. And this doesn't sit well at all with Scott. As a matter of fact, it sits with him so badly that he stops the training session to speak with Professor Xavier. He's actually frustrated by the fact that they're using Rogue in one of their training seminars as though she is an enemy, especially because Scott believes that they should be working towards making a friend out of Rogue and getting her to join his side. As a matter of fact, he seems to be the only X-Man that feels bad about using Rogue in this demonstration, and he voices these concerns to Jean as they're heading off to their school trip.
Look, how can we pretend she's the enemy in battle simulations while we're trying to convince her to be our friend? If we can't think of her as a friend, she'll never want to join us.
And Scott's heart is really in the right place, but unfortunately, somebody hears this information who shouldn't have, that being Mystique, who is considerably happy to hear this because it gives her more ammunition to keep Rogue on her side and to keep Rogue far, far away from the X-Men. And so she gives Rogue this information and tasks Rogue with going on the school field trip. And while being on this field trip, the bus driver loses control and nearly crashes them off the side of the road, and if it wasn't for Scott's intervention, the entire group of students probably would have been dead. But now that leaves them without a bus and stranded in a snowstorm, which of course leads Scott and a few of the others to have to hop on snowmobiles in order to pursue finding shelter. And in the process, because Rogue is feeling an extreme animosity towards Scott, she ends up not only trying to race him, but nearly tries to kill him. And now part of this is on Scott, as he did fuel the sort of racing that they were trying to do. But at the end of the day, he is kind of flabbergasted that Rogue would even do something like that. And so when they do reach shelter, Scott obviously follows after Rogue. He wants to get her to join his side. He still cares for Rogue. He believes in her as a mutant, but before Scott can even express this, he is confronted by Rogue, who knows about the fact that they are fighting against her in a simulation and she wants answers.
Am I a target for you and your ex-freaks?
It's
true, isn't it? I know all about your battle simulation. The one where I'm the enemy.
No, wait. Rogue, it's complicated. We're not who you think we are. We've never tried to hurt you. You've been lied to. We want you with us.
Scott's genuine care and belief in Rogue nearly gets him killed, as Mystique quite literally tries to kill a teenager. Man, if you sit back and think about it sometimes, it's a little ridiculous. But regardless, Rogue is able to absorb Mystique's memories and figure out that it was in fact her that attacked Rogue instead of the X-Men. And so Rogue goes out of her way in order to try and save Scott's life, as the two of them are going to be fighting for their lives, not only between Mystique, but between the fact that they're in freezing cold water in the middle of a snowstorm in New York. And because Scott ended up believing so much in Rogue, he ended up bringing out the hero inside of Rogue. I'm still 100% convinced that if it wasn't for Scott, Rogue would have never flipped sides to being an X-Men, and she'd still be a part of the Brotherhood to this day. It was truly Scott's intervention, his true belief in other mutants, that was able to bring Rogue around and sort of get her to join the X-Men.
Thanks, Professor. We're all in this together. It's nice to know we've all got something to learn. That's what makes us X-Men.
Now, Scott is also extremely competitive, like very competitive. So in one episode, Scott and the X-Men have to go up against the Brotherhood of Mutants, all in a trial to see who is more physically fit, and the only reason the X-Men showed up is because they'd rather not spend the weekend training with Wolverine, because anything is easier than that. But even then, not all of them want to stay and do this, but it is once again Scott's leadership that he sort of rallies the team and gets them to believe in the fact that they can win and will beat the Brotherhood, all without using their powers. That is a very hard rule given by the Professor, which is that they can't use their powers. Except Scott is the very first person to break this engagement rule, especially after one of the Brotherhood of Mutants uses their powers on him. And while Scott is one for following rules, he can also be one to quickly get fed up when he feels these rules are limiting him, and he would rather take advantage of the fact that he is a mutant and use his powers in order to win rather than lose, because Scott hates losing.
Got something in mind, Rock Tumbler?
Scott, what do you think you're doing?
What? Nothing. I'm just fed up with those delinquents getting away with everything while we're stuck playing by the rules.
Now, this is an aspect of Scott that has been ever present since the beginning of his character. While he is one to follow the rules to an extent, the second he feels it holds him back, he is more than willing to throw them away. Hell, we had a whole arc in the X-Men comics where Scott went full evil just because it was better for mutant kind, even if it was going to damage human-mutant relationships. And while this show, obviously because it is a kid's show, can't go to that extent, I think they pick and choose the way in which to display this aspect of Scott pretty well, and they chose to do it in this episode, in which they show him cheating in order to win a competition against the Brotherhood. Part of it is his pride, and he even convinces the other X-Men to cheat, all except for Jean, because once again, Jean is willing to be Scott's anchor, and is willing not to cheat and take the harder path if it means setting a better example for the people around her. But of course, Jean's not going to let her friends die all at the same time, and so she does end up using her powers, something Scott can't seem to reconcile in the moment, simply because he is a bit hot-headed. But when push does come to shove, Scott is able to put aside not only his own feelings and his own competitiveness, but also his own ego if it means doing what's right and saving the day. And in this episode, that happens to be the fact that Juggernaut is kind of coming to kill not only Mystique, but also his brother, Charles Xavier, and so the Brotherhood and the X-Men end up teaming up in order to defeat Juggernaut. This comes with Scott being able to put aside his pride and put aside his drive and needness to win constantly, all in order to hopefully save the day.
It felt kind of right, didn't it?
What did?
You know, us and them fighting alongside. I mean, why can't they just stop drawing battle lines in the sand?
Throughout this whole episode, I've been building up Scott as being the best leader for the X-Men, why he is, why he's such a good person. But what if I told you that for the last 2 episodes of the show, he completely throws it away because of the advent of his own flesh and blood coming back from the apparent dead? Now, this episode kicks off with a bunch of mutants basically having to get into fights with one another, and Jean being kidnapped, all because Magneto is planning to make a group of super mutants. And while all of that is going on, Scott's brother is revealed to be alive. Scott and his brother were separated at birth, and it has sort of left a mark on Scott psychologically, because Scott has pretty much been adopted since he was about 2 or 3 years old and has been raised by Xavier, but he does sometimes wonder what life would be like had he lived with his brother, mother, and father. And now his brother, in an extremely vulnerable situation and having just gained his powers through a traumatic event, is now finally on the X-Men's radar, and Scott is beyond ecstatic to go, but Magneto has already gotten to his brother first and is offering him complete control over his powers. Oh, and the rest of the X-Men got hung out to dry by not having the jet for vacation. Now Scott is of course beyond excited to see his brother. It is the one thing he has wanted for so long, but he is so blinded by his feelings for his brother, he doesn't even see the danger that is right in front of him.
Man, it's like you came back from the dead!
I've had dreams just like this. Oh, me too. Oh, wow. Man, this one's real, though. And look at you. What happened to that scrawny little kid I used to pick on?
Scott willfully ignores the danger in front of him, and willfully ignores the fact that he is going to go join Magneto, essentially, all because his brother is right in front of him. He would rather spend time with his brother because it is something that he has lost. I think I've made it pretty clear throughout this video that Scott is not infallible. He does have his own problems. Scott is still a person. As a matter of fact, especially in this show, he is still a very young, growing man. And so it isn't out of the realm of possibilities that he would rather choose going with his brother, with the promise that not only will his brother get full control of his powers, but the fact that Scott might as well get full control of his abilities, something that has bothered him for a majority of his life. All being promised by Magneto, and Magneto is offering the short, easy, and quick path to getting their powers under control, whereas Charles is providing the long, arduous process. And Scott, unfortunately, is far too blinded by the fact that he loves his brother and he wants what's best for his brother, that he doesn't even bother to really see this. As a matter of fact, when Scott finds out that the other X-Men are locked up and being held, he doesn't even bother saving them because his brother convinces him otherwise. It's the fact that even though Scott is supposed to be the X-Man, he still has a weakness for his family, and he still has lessons to learn when it comes to that. And I think that's what this episode is trying to portray, is that even though Scott seems infallible, he seems like the hard militant leader, he's really not. He's still a person at the end of the day, and Scott as a person truly just wants to be with his family. And part of it is that he feels an extreme and immense amount of guilt for the fact that he basically abandoned Alex. Scott got to go to a place that accepted him. He got to go to a place where he can learn to use his abilities safely, and his brother didn't get that. So he feels extremely guilty about the fact that he got the good life in his mind, and his brother had it harder. At least that's how he felt until he met his brother. And I think that really leads heavy into the reason Scott ended up deciding to go through with becoming an evolved mutant, much like his brother chose to.
The hospital said I was the only one who made it. I wanted to be there for you, Alex. Really, I did. I'm sorry.
So Scott was willing to just give everything he has currently worked for and built for. He was willing to give it away, especially to help his brother, who is in an extreme amount of pain due to his powers. Since Alex can't control any of his powers, it feels as though constantly his joints are on fire. And so when Magneto promises to make that pain go away, to make it controllable, he just can't say no. And neither can Scott say no to his brother who is hurting, even if it means somewhat abandoning the family he has made with the X-Men. And that's how part 1 of the episode sort of leaves us, with the fact that Scott was willing to join the other side for the guilt of abandoning his brother. Now, this was the first two-parter of the show, so the second part really does try to delve into what happened when he did step into that chamber and changed. Professor Xavier tried to warn Scott, but that chamber doesn't just evolve your mutant abilities, it also changes who you are as a person on a fundamental level, and Magneto did that on purpose in order to create the perfect soldiers for himself. And while Scott does gain full control of his powers, and so does his brother, at what cost? He ends up attacking his own friends. He ends up scaring his own friends. The people that he has grown up with and lived with and who have cared for him. He even scares Jean, the person that Scott truly loves.
You and the others. You're ruining everything. This was our chance to unite, all of us.
Unite? For what, Scott? And at what cost?
It quite literally takes Scott's adopted family, the family he grew up with and grew to care for, turning their backs on him and abandoning him, for him to realize just how far he had fallen from being Scott Summers. He was someone else entirely. And it takes all of this for him to realize that he needs to make a change. It also doesn't help the fact that Magneto's base is falling from the sky and is going to be destroyed soon, and in the process would end up killing everybody in the near vicinity. But at the end of the day, Scott chooses to do the right thing. Him and his brother both use their power in combination in order to destroy Asteroid M, all in a bid to hopefully save the day. But in the process of destroying this asteroid, they also end up destroying the source of their newfound evolved powers. And so Scott and Alex both will lose full control of their powers, but in the process they will gain their families back. And we get a few heartfelt moments between the X-Men, Scott, and his brother Alex.
I'm sorry, all of you. Professor, I just... I made some bad choices.
If nothing else, at least I have my brother back. And that's what really matters to me.
Yeah, me too.
And in the end, we return to the status quo, in which we get back Scott Summers, the man who is willing to put his life on the line for the people around him, and who is willing to be the X-Man. He's not infallible, he's not perfect, but he strives to do what is best for the people around him. And that is Scott Summers, and I think they did a fairly decent job of adapting him for this first season of X-Men Evolution. While he doesn't really change a lot, and his only major arc is within the last 2 episodes of the show, I definitely do feel like he was a well put together addition to this. Definitely did a way better job of adapting him than they did in the X-Men movies, but that is a video for another day. Regardless, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for watching. I truly appreciate it. Shout out for 15,000 subs, that's just amazing. Now I want to take a second to just thank you all for watching the video. If you like the video, please leave me a like, it helps out a lot. If you really do enjoy the videos, and if it's your first time, or maybe you've come back to a few, consider subscribing. It's free and you can unsub at any time, and all that other fun YouTuber stuff. If you dislike the video, please leave me a dislike and then let me know in the comments why. Do you feel I didn't do a good job of analyzing, or do you just feel like I don't understand the character? Please let me know down below, as it helps me improve my videos. And finally, I do run a Patreon if you feel so inclined to support. Now on Patreon, you will typically get these videos early and you will get them completely unedited, as I do have to make changes for the YouTube versions and cut some things for it. But don't feel as though you have to, your viewership is more than enough. But now is the time in the video where I shout out my $5 Patreon tier members and above. They are awesome and amazing, and that would be Dakota Rawson, Donovan Gomez, MC Bomb 27. That's it for me, and I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day.